The ink still gleamed wet on the marriage contract when James Ashford realized his life as a free man had come to an end. Sitting in the shadowy library of his stepfather's estate, he watched the elaborate letters that sealed his fate, while Cornelius Ashford, the man who had usurped his late mother's surname, smiled with cruel satisfaction from across the mahogany table. "Sign, boy," Cornelius ordered, his grave voice echoing among the bookshelves filled with volumes James had never seen his stepfather open. "Mrs. Margaret Hartley awaits a husband, and you need a roof over your head. A convenient transaction for both." James clenched his fists beneath the table. At 26, he should have been managing Rosewood Manor, the estate his mother had left him. Instead, he found himself practically indigent, expelled from his own inheritance by legal maneuvers he hadn't fully understood after Lady Catherine Ashford's premature death. Cornelius, the second son of a declining family who had won his widowed mother's heart, had revealed his true nature only after the funeral. "And what if I refuse?" James raised his gaze, knowing the answer. "Then you will continue living on the docks of Portsmouth, working as a stevedore." Cornelius poured himself brandy, the amber liquid dancing in the crystal. "A noble occupation for someone whose grandfather was a baron. I'm sure your mother would be proud." The mention of his mother made James shudder. Catherine Ashford had been too kind, too trusting. She had fallen for Cornelius's superficial charm and altered her will, granting her new husband powers he had used ruthlessly after her sudden death. Fever, the doctors had said. James had always suspected something more sinister, but without proof, his accusations sounded like the lamentations of a disgruntled son. "Who is she?" James asked, resigned. "This widow who agrees to marry a man in such a condition." "Margaret Hartley, widow of Sir Edmund Hartley. He passed away 2 years ago, leaving her with considerable fortune and a deplorable reputation." Cornelius leaned back, savoring each word. "They say she possesses an impossible temper and an appearance that justifies her prolonged singlehood after becoming a widow. No gentleman of position courts her despite her wealth. You, my dear stepson, are not in a position to be demanding." James picked up the quill. Every fiber of his being rebelled against that capitulation, but winter was approaching, and his months of savings from working at the docks barely covered lodging and food. Cornelius had chosen the perfect moment for his venomous proposal. "Is there anything else I should know?" he asked, the quill suspended above the paper. "Only that the ceremony will take place in 3 days at the chapel of Hartley House in Kent. She insists on discretion. Apparently she doesn't wish for a public spectacle of your union." Cornelius's smile widened. "I've provided suitable clothes. We can't have you showing up as the beggar you've become." James signed. Every letter of his name felt like a stone tied to his ankles, dragging him into depths from which he would never emerge. When he finished, Cornelius picked up the document with predatory satisfaction. "Excellent. She paid generously for this arrangement, I must admit. £500 for your hand. Consider yourself valued, boy." He rose, smoothing his embroidered coat. "A servant will fetch you on Wednesday at dawn. I suggest you shave and appear somewhat grateful. The woman may be desperate, but she has pride." When Cornelius left the library, James remained seated, contemplating his own hands. Hands that had once held the reins of thoroughbreds and signed invitations to balls, now calloused from manual labor. In 3 days they would belong to a wife who had bought a husband as if acquiring cattle at market. The journey to Kent passed in oppressive silence. The servant accompanying him, an elderly man with a neutral expression, offered no conversation, and James found himself lost in increasingly dark thoughts. The autumnal landscape slid past the carriage window, the golden and crimson leaves contrasting with the leaden sky, a perfect reflection of his state of mind. Hartley House emerged through the evening mist like an apparition from a Gothic tale. The estate, built of grey stone, rose imposing amidst formal gardens that were beginning to succumb to the season's neglect. Hexagonal towers flanked the main structure, and leaded glass windows reflected the dying light of day like lifeless eyes. "The mistress awaits in the main hall," the servant informed him when the carriage stopped before the main entrance. James disembarked, adjusting the borrowed coat Cornelius had provided. The garment fit him reasonably well, though the style was slightly old-fashioned. He felt like an actor in a play whose plot he didn't know, marching towards an outcome he hadn't chosen. The interior of Hartley House contrasted surprisingly with its external austerity. Though furnished with the taste of the previous century, the house radiated a discreet warmth. Tapestries in shades of dark green and gold covered the walls, and highly polished chandeliers reflected the candlelight. A middle-aged housekeeper led him through corridors to a spacious drawing room, where a crackling fireplace battled the cold, seeping through the ancient stones. She stood with her back to him, contemplating the fire. Margaret Hartley wore a moss-green velvet dress, the fabric rich but without excessive adornment. Her hair, an indefinable shade of brown, was pulled back in a simple arrangement at the nape of her neck. She did not turn when James entered. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice surprisingly melodious, devoid of the harshness he had anticipated. "Welcome to Hartley House, Mrs. Hartley." James bowed formally, though she could not see him. "I appreciate your hospitality." "Hospitality," she laughed. A brief and bitter sound. A curious word for such peculiar circumstances. She finally turned. James had prepared himself to confront the monster her reputation suggested. Instead, he found a woman of approximately 30, with features that could not be called beautiful by conventional standards, but which possessed something more interesting than mere beauty. Her brown eyes were intelligent and direct, studying him with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously exposed and intrigued. A thin scar ran across her left eyebrow, giving her a distinctive appearance. Her face was angular, her chin resolute, her lips thin but well-formed. "Not what you expected?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, the scarred one. There was a challenge in her voice. "I confess I didn't know what to expect," James replied honestly. Honesty, a rare quality. Margaret moved to a side table where a bottle of wine and 2 glasses rested. "Did your stepfather inform you of the terms?" "He informed me that you require a husband, and I require means of subsistence, a commercial transaction." "Precisely." She poured the wine with precise movements. "No useless romanticisms or pretensions. You lend me your name and occasional presence at social events, where an unescorted widow causes comment. I provide you with a comfortable residence and a suitable allowance." She extended a glass to him, a marriage of convenience in its purest form. James accepted the wine, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "And is that what you wish? An agreement without substance?" "I desire peace, Mr. Ashford. My first marriage taught me that affection is a dangerous luxury." Her eyes darkened momentarily. "Sir Edmund was chosen by my father. I learned to value independence, even if imperfect." There was a story there, James realized, pain in the subtext of her carefully chosen words. Before he could reply, she raised her glass. "To our pragmatic union, may it prove mutually tolerable." James raised his, "To mutual tolerance." The wine was excellent, rich and complex. Like everything else that evening, it was not what he had expected. Margaret Hartley was an enigma, and James found himself unexpectedly curious about the mysteries she concealed beneath that controlled facade. The ceremony would be in the morning. Until then, he would remain suspended between the man he had been and the man he would become, married to a stranger by convenience, stripped of everything except his stained name. And yet, something in the way Margaret observed him, appraising but not cruel, suggested that perhaps there was more to this arrangement than either of them admitted. The wedding morning dawned wrapped in a thick fog, the kind that transformed the world into an indistinct phantasmagoria. James awoke in the guest chamber assigned to him, a comfortable room decorated in shades of teal and cream, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Then reality descended upon him like a heavy shroud. Today he would become Margaret Hartley's husband. A servant had brought hot water and carefully laid out clothes, a formal suit in dark tones appropriate for a discreet ceremony. James shaved with hands that trembled slightly, observing his own reflection in the silver-framed mirror. The man staring back at him looked older than his 26 years, lines of worry marking his forehead, shadows beneath the blue eyes that had once been brighter. When had he last truly slept well? Before his mother's death? Certainly. He dressed with the mechanical care of someone performing a necessary but joyless task. The waistcoat fit perfectly. The coat fell in elegant lines over his shoulders. Someone had taken his measurements precisely. Margaret, he presumed, or her efficient staff. There was something disconcerting in the attention to detail, as if she had planned this wedding with the meticulousness of a general planning a military campaign. The chapel of Hartley House was a small structure adjacent to the main estate, built in the same Gothic style. James arrived 15 minutes before the appointed time and found the interior surprisingly welcoming. Old stained-glass windows filtered the morning light in shades of amber and sapphire, and the scent of incense mingled with the perfume of white lilies arranged in porcelain vases. There were only 5 people waiting: the local vicar, a corpulent man with rosy cheeks; the housekeeper James had met the previous evening, an elderly gentleman of distinguished appearance who had not been introduced, and 2 servants who would serve as witnesses. "Mr. Ashford," the elderly gentleman approached, extending his hand. "Allow me to introduce myself. Lord Percival Worthington, executor of the late Sir Edmund Hartley's will and a long-standing family friend. I shall take the liberty of escorting Mrs. Margaret, as she has no living father to do so." James shook his hand, noting the firm grip despite the man's advanced age. Lord Worthington must have been 70, but his grey eyes were penetrating, assessing James with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a magnifying glass. "It is an honour to meet you, Lord Worthington. We shall see." The reply was dry but not devoid of humour. "Margaret is special to me. I've known her since childhood. If you cause her unnecessary suffering, young man, you will find that I possess considerable influence in various spheres." The veiled threat was delivered with perfect courtesy, but James understood its seriousness. "I have no intention of harming her, sir. This arrangement may be unconventional, but I am not cruel." Worthington studied him for a prolonged moment before nodding briefly. "Very well. Then perhaps you are more suitable than I initially feared." Before James could question that enigmatic declaration, the chapel doors opened. Margaret entered with a firm and determined step, without virginal hesitation or false modesty. She wore an ivory-coloured silk dress, simple in design but exquisite in execution, the fabric flowing over her slender body like liquid water. A short lace veil partially covered her face, but did not conceal her determined expression. She carried no bouquet, only a small leather-bound missal. Their eyes met as she reached the altar. James searched for some sign of regret or hesitation on her face, but found only calm resolution. Whatever had motivated her to this peculiar marriage, she did not falter now. The vicar began the ceremony with a monotonous voice that suggested it was just another obligation in a long day. James responded when necessary, the familiar words of the Anglican ritual sounding strange in his own ears. Margaret pronounced her vows with crystal clarity, without emotional ornamentation. When it was time for James to place the ring on her finger, he noticed that her hands were delicate but not fragile, her fingers long and capable. "I declare you husband and wife," the vicar concluded with apparent relief. "You may kiss the bride." James leaned in, lifting the veil. Margaret raised her face, her eyes fixed on his, defiant. He pressed his lips against hers briefly, a chaste touch that fulfilled the formality without seeking intimacy. Her lips were soft and cold, and so it was done. James Ashford had become the husband of a woman he barely knew, in a ceremony witnessed by strangers, without celebration or joy. When he drew back, he saw something pass through Margaret's eyes, something that might have been relief or sadness disappearing too quickly to identify. Lord Worthington approached, kissing Margaret's cheek with paternal affection. "Congratulations, my dear. I hope you find what you seek in this arrangement." "Thank you, Uncle Percy." Margaret's voice softened as she addressed the elder, revealing a dimension of affection that surprised James. So she was not entirely devoid of human warmth. A small breakfast followed in the dining room of Hartley House. The meal was civilized but strangely melancholic, like a polite funeral. Lord Worthington dominated the conversation with carefully chosen reminiscences about the estate's history, avoiding mentions of the late Sir Edmund that James noted were conspicuous by their absence. Margaret ate little, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate with elegant disinterest. When Worthington finally withdrew, bidding farewell with promises of a visit soon, James found himself alone with his new wife for the first time as a married man. The silence stretched between them like a rope under tension. "I suppose we should discuss practical arrangements," Margaret finally said, placing her napkin with precision beside her plate. "Your apartments are in the east wing, mine in the west. There's a considerable library if you appreciate reading, and the gardens, though neglected, still offer pleasant paths. You have complete freedom of the estate. And as for social expectations?" James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You mentioned events where my presence would be required. There's an occasional dinner with neighboring families, an annual ball in December. Nothing excessive." Margaret rose, smoothing her skirt. "As for other aspects of matrimony, I presume we are both adults capable of maintaining appearances when necessary without imposing unwanted intimacies." Her frankness should have relieved him, but instead James felt a strange pang of something that might have been disappointment. "I understand." "I doubt it," Margaret replied, and for the first time a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "But you will understand eventually." She moved towards the door, then paused, looking over her shoulder. "There is something I must show you tonight, in my apartments. Come at 9 o'clock. It is important." Before James could question her, she had disappeared, leaving him alone in the dining room, with the remnants of the nuptial breakfast and a growing confusion of thoughts. The day dragged on with torturous slowness. James explored the estate, discovering that Hartley House was considerably larger than it appeared externally. There was an entire wing closed off, rooms covered with white sheets like silent ghosts. The library Margaret had mentioned was impressive, walls lined with volumes on history, philosophy, literature. Someone there had been a voracious reader, Sir Edmund or Margaret. In the stables he found 4 well-kept horses, including a magnificent black stallion that whinnied at the sight of him. The stableman, a taciturn middle-aged man, informed him that this was Midnight, Sir Edmund's favourite horse. "The mistress doesn't ride," he added, "says horses make her nervous. A shame, really. Midnight needs proper exercise." James spent the afternoon riding through Hartley's lands, allowing the cold wind and physical activity to calm his turbulent thoughts. The estate stretched for acres, including dense woods and rolling meadows. It was beautiful, though neglected. With proper management, it could be magnificent. When he returned at dusk, he found a hot bath awaiting him in his apartments and clean clothes laid out. The invisible efficiency of Margaret's servants was remarkable. He washed, dressed, and at precisely 9 o'clock, presented himself before the door to his wife's apartments in the west wing. Margaret answered personally, wearing a midnight blue velvet robe over a nightgown. Her hair was loose, falling in waves to her waist, and for the first time James saw her truly disarmed. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Margaret's apartments were surprisingly Spartan. Quality furniture, but without excessive ornamentation, neutral colors, none of the feminine touches he would expect. The exception was a writing desk by the window, covered with papers and documents. Margaret went to the writing desk, picking up a polished wooden box. "I made a promise to myself," she began, "that if I proceeded with this marriage, there would be no deception between us. You deserve to know the truth." James watched as she opened the box, revealing a stack of carefully organized documents. "Your stepfather, Cornelius Ashford, is a thief and possibly a murderer," Margaret said, her words falling like stones into a silent lake. "These documents prove that he defrauded your mother's will, forged legal transactions, and diverted funds from the Rosewood estate to his own accounts. And there is more." She handed him a sealed envelope. "The deed to Rosewood Manor. Your legitimate inheritance registered in your name. I acquired it 3 months ago through intermediaries." James took the envelope with hands that trembled uncontrollably. "How? Why?" "Because," Margaret said softly, "I also know what it is to be a prisoner of cruel circumstances, and because your stepfather made a fatal error in offering you to me." Her eyes shone intensely. "He didn't realize that I have resources and determination that go far beyond mere wealth." James looked at the documents, then at the woman before him. "You planned all of this. Yes. Why? What do you gain? Margaret turned towards the window. Revenge, Mr. Ashford. Cornelius destroyed someone I loved. Now I will destroy everything he built upon his lies. She looked at him over her shoulder. And you, if you choose, will be my ally in this endeavor. The silence that followed Margaret's words was so dense that James could hear the beating of his own heart. He held the envelope as if it contained not just legal documents, but the very key to his redemption. His fingers trembled as he broke the wax seal, revealing meticulously organized papers. There it was, the deed to Rosewood Manor, registered in his name, dated 2 months prior. His vision blurred momentarily. How did you manage this? His voice came out hoarse, laden with an emotion he struggled to contain. Margaret moved away from the window, gliding with controlled grace across the room to sit in a chair near the fireplace, where embers still crackled. The flickering light danced on her face, alternately revealing and concealing the emotional scars she carried as clearly as the one on her eyebrow. Cornelius is an ambitious man, but not as intelligent as he believes himself to be, she began, her fingers interlaced in her lap. After illegally acquiring Rosewood, he needed funds to maintain the estate. Land without money is a burden, not a privilege. He began accumulating debts, mainly gambling debts. I bought these debts through intermediaries, then offered him a deal. I would pay everything if he arranged a marriage for me with a young gentleman of good family, someone who would lend respectability to my name without making inconvenient demands. James sank slowly into an opposite chair, still clutching the papers like a lifeline. Did he offer me specifically, or did you direct him? Oh, I directed him, Mr. Ashford. With great subtlety. A bitter smile curved her lips. I mentioned my desire for a husband who understood injustice, someone who wouldn't judge me by my appearance or reputation. Cornelius, always eager to demonstrate his supposed cunning, boasted of having a troublesome stepson who would be perfect for my purposes, a fallen gentleman who wouldn't dare question his benefits. The revelation should have enraged him, but James found himself curiously calm. His entire life in recent years had been a series of manipulations and betrayals. At least this time the manipulation served his interests. You mentioned revenge, he said carefully, that Cornelius destroyed someone you loved. May I ask who? Margaret's expression closed like a book snapped shut. She averted her gaze, fixing it on the flames. For a long moment, James thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low he had to lean in to hear. My sister, Helena. The words came out like a confession torn under torture. She was 5 years younger than I, beautiful in ways I never was. Golden hair, blue eyes, a laugh like silver bells. Everything I was not. James waited, intuiting that interrupting her would break the fragile thread of trust she offered. Our father was a baron without considerable resources, but with high pretensions. When Sir Edmund Hartley, 30 years my senior and a recent widower, asked for my hand, father accepted immediately. I was 19 and had no choice. She paused, her fingers clenching. Edmund was not a cruel man in the conventional sense. He didn't beat me. But there was a coldness in him, an indifference that was its own form of cruelty. He desired an heir, and when after 3 years I had given him no son, his disappointment turned to contempt. The pain in her voice was palpable, and James felt an unexpected compassion tighten his chest. Helena remained unmarried until she was 20, which alarmed our father. He began searching for a suitor, someone who would restore the family's deteriorated finances. That's when Cornelius Ashford appeared. Margaret finally turned her gaze to James, and he saw an ancient fury burning there. He courted her with a charm I imagine you know well. Helena fell completely in love. Father was delighted. They married in a beautiful ceremony in the spring of 1842. James made quick calculations, 3 years before Cornelius met his mother. Helena wrote to me regularly in the first year, Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier, as if narrating the facts returned some control to her. Cheerful letters about life in London, about parties and theatre. Then the letters changed. They became shorter, more guarded. She mentioned that Cornelius was often absent, that there were debts, arguments. In the last letter I received, she implored me to visit her. She said she needed help. And did you go? I tried. Edmund initially refused me permission. When I finally convinced him, arriving at Helena's residence in London, I found the house closed. Neighbours informed me that Cornelius had left in a hurry 3 weeks prior, taking all valuables. Helena. Her voice broke for the first time. Helena had been found dead in her bed. They said it was fever, but the maid who had cared for her in her last weeks confessed to me, weeping, that her mistress had vomited blood, that she had suffered terrible agonies, symptoms consistent with poisoning. My God! James rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floorboards. You believe he murdered her? I believe he married her for her modest inheritance, dissipated it in months, and when she became inconvenient, he disposed of her. Margaret also rose, moving to the writing desk. She opened a drawer and took out more documents. I investigated for years. Here are records of his debts from that period, growing exponentially. Here, Helena's will, leaving everything to him. And here, she held up a yellowed paper, with reverent care. A letter from an apothecary recording an unusual sale of arsenic to a man whose description perfectly matches Cornelius. James accepted the papers, examining them by candlelight. The evidence was circumstantial, but convincing. Why didn't you take this to the authorities? I tried. Cornelius had already left for Bath, where he met your mother 6 months later. Without a body to examine, without witnesses willing to testify against a gentleman, without resources to hire proper investigators, my accusations were dismissed as the hysteria of a grieving sister. Bitterness tinged every word. Edmund was alive then, and refused to support my cause. He said I was shaming the Hartley name with my morbid obsessions. James began to understand the layers of pain that had shaped the woman before him. So you waited. I waited and I planned. When Edmund died 2 years ago, leaving me his entire fortune, I finally had the means to act. But Cornelius had become careful, protected by the respectability of his marriage to your mother. I couldn't touch him directly, without risking a scandal that would further tarnish Helena's memory. She moved closer to him, her eyes fixed on his. Until your mother died, circumstances suspiciously similar to Helena's. James's blood ran cold. Do you believe he also murdered my mother? I cannot prove it, but the patterns are remarkably similar. Sudden illness, swift death, convenient beneficiary. Margaret touched his arm lightly, the gesture surprisingly gentle. When I learned he had dispossessed you of your inheritance, I saw an opportunity. You were a victim like Helena, like me, and you had a right to the truth. James pulled away, walking to the window where Margaret had stood before. The night beyond the glass was absolute, the fog transforming the world into a black void. His mind reeled, processing revelations that reframed everything he had thought to understand about the past few years. This wedding night is certainly not what I anticipated, he said finally, trying to inject a lightness he didn't feel. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound this time, though touched with sadness. Nor I. But preferable to the alternative, don't you think? Polite lies and comfortable ignorance. He turned to face her. So this marriage, this entire arrangement, was a strategy to destroy Cornelius. Partially, she admitted, but it was also an act of restitution. I couldn't save Helena, but I can help you reclaim what is rightfully yours. And, she hesitated, vulnerability crossing her face. I confess there was selfishness too. 2 years alone in this house, haunted by memories of a loveless marriage and a lost sister, had become unbearable. I thought an ally in my cause, even if acquired by unorthodox means, would be preferable to perpetual solitude. James returned to the writing desk, examining the scattered documents again. Proof of fraud, deeds, correspondence. Margaret had built a meticulous case against Cornelius. With those papers, he could not only reclaim Rosewood, but also completely destroy his stepfather's reputation, possibly see him criminally prosecuted. What do you suggest we do? He asked. For now, nothing rash. Margaret joined him at the writing desk. Cornelius believes you are adequately neutralized, tied to an eccentric wife in Kent, out of his concern. Let him remain in that comfortable conviction. Meanwhile, we will use these documents to legally consolidate your ownership of Rosewood. I have a discreet lawyer in London who can initiate proceedings without alerting Cornelius until it's too late for him to react. And then? After that, we confront him with evidence of his frauds. We offer him a choice: silent exile or public exposure and probable imprisonment. Her eyes shone with steely determination. I prefer the latter option, but I understand if you wish to avoid scandal. James considered carefully. Part of him yearned for public revenge, to see Cornelius humiliated as he himself had been humiliated. But another part, the part that had inherited his mother's kindness, hesitated before the brutality of such an exposure. "May I consider the options?" he asked finally. "Naturally, I don't expect you to make a decision immediately." Margaret began organizing the papers, her hands moving with practical efficiency. "There is much to process. I recognize that I have overwhelmed you with revelations on your wedding night." "Margaret," he waited until she looked at him, "thank you for all of this, for giving me a choice when I had none." Something softened in her expression, the careful armor dropping momentarily. "Everyone deserves a choice, James. It's the least I can offer." They remained like that for a suspended moment, two strangers bound by tragedy and common purpose, the roles between them promising both justice and destruction. James understood that his life had irrevocably changed that night, but for the first time since his mother's death, he felt something beyond despair. He felt hope. The following week unfolded into a strange domestic routine James had never imagined possible. During the day, he and Margaret maintained a cordial distance, meeting only at meals where they conversed about trivial matters with the politeness of strangers in a tea room. However, when the clock struck 9, James would make his way to his wife's chambers, where both shed their social masks and dedicated themselves to the meticulous work of constructing Cornelius Ashford's ruin. Margaret proved to be a formidable strategist. Her mind operated with a precision that James found simultaneously impressive and slightly intimidating. She had spread the documents across the table in the private library adjacent to her chambers, creating a visual web of evidence that connected every fraud, every suspicious transaction, every lie Cornelius had built over the years. "Here," she said one evening, pointing to a series of bank receipts, "we can see how he transferred funds from the Rosewood account to personal investments. And here," her finger slid to another document, "the forgery of your mother's signature authorizing the sale of lands that were meant to remain inalienable according to the original will." James leaned over the table, studying the papers by candlelight. His mother's handwriting had been imitated with considerable skill, but now that he knew what to look for, he could identify the subtle inconsistencies. The slightly heavier stroke on the ascending letters, the incorrect curve of the capital S that his mother always drew with a distinctive flourish. "How did you gain access to all these documents?" he asked. "Not for the first time." Money opens surprising doors, especially when discreetly applied to the right staff. Margaret leaned back in her chair, massaging her temple as she did when they had been working for hours. A clerk at Cornelius's bank, a housekeeper at his London residence, the very lawyer he dismissed when the man questioned certain transactions, all had valuable information and their own reasons for wishing to see Cornelius exposed. James watched her in the golden candlelight. During those late-night sessions, Margaret transformed. The stiffness she maintained during the day dissolved, revealing a woman of sharp intellect and fierce passion. He began to understand that her reputation for an impossible temper likely stemmed from her refusal to conform to the suffocating expectations placed upon women of her station. She was not impossible. She was indomitable. "There's something that puzzles me," James said, moving away from the table to pour himself wine from the bottle Margaret always kept available. "Why not simply expose him immediately? You have enough evidence. Why this elaboration?" Margaret accepted the glass he offered her, her fingers brushing his briefly. James had noticed that she had become less wary of casual touch during those evenings, as if the proximity forced by their common project was wearing down the barriers they both maintained. "Because immediate exposure would give him an opportunity to flee or destroy additional evidence we haven't yet uncovered," she explained. "Cornelius is like a cornered rat when threatened. We need to ensure every exit is blocked before we shine a light. Besides, She paused, something dark crossing her face. I want him to feel the trap closing in gradually, to experience the same growing despair Helena must have felt when she realized she was trapped. The thirst for vengeance in her voice should have disturbed him, but James understood it deeply. He himself had spent nights on the docks of Portsmouth, imagining elaborate scenarios of retribution against the man who had stolen his life. Now, for the first time, those fantasies were beginning to take tangible form. "The lawyer in London," James said, changing the subject to more practical territory. "When can he begin the legal proceedings to transfer Rosewood?" "Lord Worthington has contacted him on my behalf. He awaits only your signature on certain documents I've prepared." Margaret rose, moving to the smaller writing desk in the corner of the library. She returned with a leather portfolio. "Here they are. Powers of attorney, sworn statements, formal petitions. All that is needed is your signature." James opened the portfolio, examining the documents with the care he had learned to apply to all legal matters. Margaret watched him patiently, without pressure, allowing him to read every word. When he finally picked up the pen, she offered him an inkwell without comment. He signed each document methodically, his handwriting steady, despite the nervous tremor in his hands. Each signature seemed to seal not just a legal agreement, but a deeper commitment between him and Margaret. They were truly united now, conspirators and accomplices in a project that could redeem them or destroy them. "Done," he said finally, laying down the pen. "And now we wait. The process will take weeks, possibly months." Margaret gathered the documents carefully. "In the meantime, we must maintain the appearance of an ordinary marriage. There's a dinner at the Pemberton estate next week. We've been invited." James groaned inwardly. Social events had always been his greatest weakness, even when he possessed position and resources. Now, as the recent husband of a woman whose peculiarities were notorious, the prospect was even less appealing. Margaret chuckled at his expression. "Courage, Mr. Ashford, it won't be so terrible. The Pembertons are a pleasant family, and Lady Pemberton has always been kind to me despite the gossip." "Gossip?" James raised an eyebrow. "About you?" She looked away, a shadow of embarrassment crossing her features. "Surely you've heard. The strange widow who prefers books to company, who never smiles properly, who possesses a disfiguring scar and a tongue too sharp for her own good." "I do not consider your scar disfiguring," James said before he could censor himself. "It gives you distinctive character." Margaret turned back quickly, genuine surprise in her eyes. "You are kind to say so, but we both know it does not meet the standards of feminine beauty." "Conventional standards are tediously limited." James moved closer to her, propelled by something he didn't fully analyze. "You possess a formidable intellect, impressive determination, and more courage than many men I know. That is considerably more interesting than mere aesthetic conformity." A subtle blush colored Margaret's cheeks, and for the first time, James saw her truly disconcerted. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally murmured, "You continue to surprise me, James." The use of his given name, without the formal Mr. Ashford, resonated between them with unexpected intimacy. James became suddenly aware of how close they were, of the subtle lavender scent she wore, of the way the candlelight caught golden reflections in her brown hair. He recoiled, disturbed by the direction of his thoughts. This was a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement based on mutual objectives. There was no room for emotional complications. "It's getting late," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "I should retire." Margaret nodded, recomposing her controlled posture, but James noticed that her fingers trembled slightly as she tidied the papers on the table. "Yes, naturally, until tomorrow." James left her chambers and crossed the silent corridors to the east wing, his mind turbulent. Something was changing between him and Margaret, something subtle but undeniable. What had begun as a practical alliance was developing layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. In his chambers, he prepared for sleep mechanically, but slumber eluded him. He lay in the darkness, contemplating the canopy over his bed, thinking of Margaret alone in the west wing, perhaps equally awake, perhaps thinking of him too. The following week brought a change in routine. Letters began to arrive from London, reports from the lawyer about the progress of the legal proceedings. Each communication, brought encouraging news. The documents Margaret had compiled were irrefutable. Cornelius's frauds methodically exposed before judges and magistrates. Margaret shared each letter with James during their nightly meetings, both leaning over the correspondence like diligent students. He had begun to anticipate those encounters with something dangerously close to eagerness, not just for the progress in their case, but for her company, for the conversations that extended beyond practical matters to philosophy, literature, childhood memories. She had told him about growing up in the shadow of a prettier sister, always second choice, always deemed inadequate. He had shared memories of his mother, of the pain of watching her change after marrying Cornelius, slowly losing the vitality that had defined her. "Sometimes I think," Margaret said one night, "that people like Cornelius are plagues. They infiltrate lives, consume everything good and nourishing, then move on to the next host, leaving only devastation." "Then we are the remedy," James replied, "the cure for the infection." An apt medical metaphor. She smiled faintly. Though cures are often painful, necessary pain for future health. They clinked their wineglasses, a gesture that had become a ritual. In that moment, watching her in the golden candlelight, her eyes shining with determination, and something softer he couldn't name, James understood that he was developing feelings for his wife of convenience that transcended gratitude or camaraderie. The revelation should have alarmed him. Instead, he felt strangely tranquil, like a sailor who finally sights shore after a long journey on tempestuous seas. The Pemberton dinner awaited them in 3 days. Before that, correspondence would arrive that would change everything. The correspondence arrived on a grey morning, 3 days before the Pemberton dinner. James was in the library examining a volume on rural estate management when the housekeeper entered, carrying a silver tray with a single envelope. The red wax seal bore a crest he didn't immediately recognize. "For Mrs. Hartley, sir," the housekeeper announced. The messenger said it was urgent. James accepted the envelope, noting the superior quality paper and the elaborate handwriting. "Where is my wife?" "In the gardens, sir. She has been walking much this morning." He found Margaret in the hedge maze that occupied the southeast corner of the estate. She wore a grey wool coat over a simple dress, her hair partially escaping its usual arrangement, giving her an unexpectedly youthful appearance. When she heard his footsteps on the gravel, she turned, and James saw that her cheeks were flushed from exercise and the fresh air. "James," her casual use of his name had become natural in recent weeks. "Has something happened?" "Urgent correspondence." He handed her the envelope. Margaret accepted it, studying the seal with eyes that narrowed slightly. "It's from Lady Ashford." "Who?" "Cornelius's third-degree cousin, if my research is correct, a widow who resides in Bath." Margaret carefully broke the seal, her eyes scanning the written lines with impressive speed. James watched as her expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, then to something that resembled cautious triumph. "What does it say?" "Lady Ashford requests a private meeting with me in Bath." Margaret looked up, her eyes shining. "She mentions that she possesses information about the questionable circumstances of Lady Catherine Ashford's death and wishes to share it with someone who can use it appropriately." James's heart quickened. "She knows something about my mother's death. Apparently so. And it seems her relationship with Cornelius has deteriorated significantly." Margaret folded the letter with precision. She writes that her conscience no longer allows her to remain silent about matters she witnessed. "It could be a trap," James warned, though every fiber of his being yearned to believe they would finally obtain the proof they needed. "Possible, but unlikely. Lady Ashford is known for her eccentricity, but not for particular loyalty to Cornelius. I've heard rumors of an inheritance dispute years ago." Margaret began walking back towards the house, James accompanying her. "We must go to Bath." "When?" "Tomorrow. The sooner the better. If she possesses valuable information, we cannot risk her changing her mind or Cornelius discovering her intentions." That night in their chambers, Margaret and James planned the trip with military meticulousness. They would travel as a respectable couple, visiting the thermal waters of Bath for health reasons. Lord Worthington would be informed of their location, but no one else. Discretion was essential. "We will need separate rooms at the inn," Margaret said, marking items on her list. "Appearances must be maintained." James nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment that practical statement provoked. In recent weeks, the boundaries between convenience and something more genuine had become dangerously blurred. He found himself thinking of Margaret during the day, anticipating their nightly meetings, memorizing details like the way she bit her lower lip when concentrated, or how her genuine laugh completely transformed her expression. "James," her voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are you well?" "Yes, forgive me. I was just considering the possibilities." A convenient lie. If Lady Ashford truly possesses evidence of a crime, then Cornelius will not escape even by exile, Margaret completed, her features hardening. He will face full justice. The journey to Bath consumed 2 days over roads that alternated between reasonably maintained and deplorably rutted. Margaret proved to be a surprisingly pleasant travel companion, pointing out points of interest through the carriage window, sharing mordant observations about passers-by that made James laugh in a way he hadn't in years. During stops at inns along the way, they maintained the role of a polite but discreet couple. James found himself hyper-aware of every interaction, of the way he offered his hand to help her alight from the carriage, of how she accepted his arm as they entered establishments. Small touches that meant nothing and meant everything. On the second night, staying in a modest but clean inn in Reading, James couldn't sleep. His room was adjacent to Margaret's, and he could hear her soft movements through the thin wall. He imagined her equally awake, contemplating the meeting that awaited them. When they finally reached Bath, the city proved as elegant as its reputation suggested. Streets of golden limestone, impeccable Georgian architecture, formal gardens where members of high society strolled, flaunting their most refined attire. Margaret had arranged accommodations in a respectable inn near the Roman baths, comfortable rooms with views of the bustling streets. Lady Ashford had suggested a meeting at the pump room the morning after their arrival. Margaret had insisted that James remain hidden initially, observing from a distance while she made contact. "Women often converse more freely among themselves," she had argued. "We can reveal your presence later, if appropriate." James acquiesced reluctantly, though every instinct protested against allowing Margaret to face a potentially dangerous situation alone. But she was correct. His presence could inhibit Lady Ashford or worse, alert her to their true intentions. On the morning of the meeting, James positioned himself in an adjacent room of the pump room, seemingly absorbed in a newspaper, but with a clear view through the open doors. Margaret arrived punctually, dressed in a shade of teal that enhanced her eyes. She accepted tea from a servant and sat near the windows, the image of composure. Lady Ashford arrived 15 minutes later, a thin woman of approximately 50, wearing an excessively ornamented lilac silk dress and a hat adorned with precariously swaying feathers. Her appearance was theatrical, almost comical, but her eyes were sharp and calculating as they assessed Margaret. James could not hear their conversation from his distance, but he observed both their body language. Margaret leaned slightly forward, attentive, occasionally nodding. Lady Ashford gestured animatedly, her gloved hands punctuating each statement. At one point, she removed a small object from her reticule, placing it on the table between them. Margaret examined it carefully before returning it. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When they finally parted, Lady Ashford left quickly, her feathers swaying with each hurried step. Margaret remained seated for an additional moment, then rose with dignity, her eyes meeting James's across the room. The slightest nod of her head confirmed what he expected. They had obtained something valuable. They met in the public gardens 30 minutes later, away from curious ears. Margaret held her parasol firmly, although the day was overcast and offered no need for sun protection. Well, James couldn't contain the anxiety in his voice. "Cornelius poisoned your mother," Margaret said without preamble, her voice low but intense. Lady Ashford was present at the estate during Lady Catherine's final days. She saw Cornelius add something to the medicinal tea the doctors had prescribed. When she questioned him, he said it was a fortifying tonic recommended by an apothecary. James felt nausea rise in his throat. Hearing confirmation of what he had always suspected was different from merely speculating. Is she certain? Absolutely. She herself became slightly ill after accepting tea from the same infusion, prepared by Cornelius, symptoms she later recognized as consistent with arsenic poisoning in small doses. Margaret reached for his arm, her fingers squeezing tightly. And there's more. Lady Catherine apparently altered her will one last time just days before her death, restoring everything to you. Cornelius destroyed that document and presented an earlier version as the final will. How does Lady Ashford know this? Because she herself served as a witness to the signing of the true will, along with the family doctor. Cornelius paid the doctor generously for his silence and threatened Lady Ashford with social scandal if she spoke. She was a recent widow then, vulnerable to blackmail. Margaret retrieved a thin envelope from her reticule. She provided a sworn statement detailing everything she witnessed, including the names of apothecaries where Cornelius acquired arsenic. James accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Through the thin paper, he could feel several densely written sheets. Why now? Why did she finally decide to speak? Cornelius refused her the financial support he had promised in exchange for her silence. Apparently, he deemed her sufficiently intimidated to no longer require payments. A fatal error. A bitter smile touched Margaret's lips. Never underestimate the fury of a woman scorned, especially when it involves money. They walked in silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. James felt contradictory emotions warring within him. Fury against Cornelius, renewed grief for the loss of his mother, a grim triumph at finally possessing irrefutable proof. "This is enough," he said finally. "With the documents of financial fraud and now evidence of murder, we can destroy him completely." "Yes." Margaret stopped, turning to face him. The light filtered through the leaves created dancing patterns on her face. "But we must carefully consider our next steps. Evidence of murder changes everything. It will not merely be a civil matter, but criminal. Cornelius could be hanged." James met her eyes, seeing there a reflection of his own doubts. Vengeance was an abstract concept when imagined. Confronted with the reality of being responsible for the death of another human being, even someone as despicable as Cornelius, the question became considerably more complex. "My mother would not have wished this," he said slowly, recognizing the truth as he spoke. "She was too gentle. Even after everything Cornelius did, I don't believe she would want to see him hanged." "But Helena," Margaret replied softly, "Helena deserves justice. And how many other potential victims are there? If we allow Cornelius to escape, how many other vulnerable widows or orphans will he destroy?" It was a compelling argument, and James had no easy answer. They remained there among Bath's formal gardens, surrounded by man-made artificial beauty, contemplating questions of life, death, and justice that no amount of aristocratic education had prepared them to face. "We have time to decide," Margaret said finally. "First, we must ensure these evidences are safe and properly documented. Lord Worthington can advise us on appropriate legal procedures." James nodded, grateful for her practicality even in such emotionally charged circumstances. "When do we return to Hartley House?" "Tomorrow. There's no reason to prolong our stay." Margaret began to walk again, and James accompanied her. "Tonight, we must dine properly. You've barely touched your food since we arrived." "Neither have you," he pointed out. "Then we shall dine together and try for a few hours to pretend we are merely a couple on a pleasant excursion to Bath." She glanced at him askance, something that might have been humor dancing in her eyes. "Do you think we can manage it?" James considered the question more seriously than she probably intended. He looked at Margaret, this extraordinary woman who had entered his life through bizarre circumstances and transformed everything. She was not simply an ally in conspiracy or a wife of convenience. She had become something significantly more important, though he still hesitated to name exactly what. "I believe," he said softly, "that we can try." The smile she offered him was genuine and disarming, transforming her features in a way that made James's heart clench. For a moment, under the grey sky of Bath, with evidence of murder weighing in his coat pocket and an uncertain future awaiting them, James allowed himself to imagine a different possibility. Not just vengeance or justice, but perhaps eventually something akin to happiness. The return to Hartley House proceeded in contemplative silence. Margaret remained leaning against the carriage cushions, her eyes fixed on the landscape gliding past the window, but James knew her mind was working feverishly, processing the implications of Lady Ashford's statement. He himself alternated between renewed fury against Cornelius and something more disturbing. The growing awareness that the man sitting before him was not the same one who had departed Hartley House days earlier. The evidence of murder had changed everything. They were no longer simply victims seeking restitution. They were accusers, armed with the power to completely destroy another human being. The weight of that responsibility settled upon James's shoulders like a leaden cloak. When they finally reached the estate on the evening of the second day, both were exhausted. The housekeeper received them with habitual efficiency, informing them that Lord Worthington had sent correspondence requesting a meeting the following morning. Margaret nodded, dismissing the servants before turning to James in the silent vestibule. "You should rest," she said, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. "Tomorrow will be a long day. And you?" James observed that she herself appeared exhausted, her rigid posture betraying the tension accumulated during the journey. "I will try." She hesitated, something unsaid hanging between them. For a moment James thought she would say more, but finally she merely inclined her head. "Good night, James." "Good night." "Margaret." He watched her ascend the staircase, each step carrying her further from him, and felt an inexplicable urgency to call her back, to not allow that night to end in separation. But the conventions that governed their lives kept him paralyzed, and she disappeared down the corridor leading to the west wing. In his chambers, James prepared for sleep mechanically, but slumber refused to come. He lay in the darkness, contemplating the invisible canopy above, thoughts ceaselessly swirling. The image of his mother in her final days haunted him, her pale face, the way her hands trembled as she held her teacup, her absolute trust in Cornelius even as he systematically poisoned her. How many times had Cornelius sat beside her, offering comfort while administering the dose that brought her closer to death? The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. And yet, it was precisely that capacity for intimate betrayal that made Cornelius so dangerous. James finally rose, unable to bear the confinement of his thoughts. He wrapped himself in a robe and left the room, moving through the silent corridors with no particular destination in mind. His feet led him, perhaps inevitably, towards the west wing. He found Margaret in the private library adjacent to her chambers, still dressed, though it was past midnight. She was bent over the writing desk, writing with fierce concentration by the light of a single candle. When James tapped softly on the doorframe, she started, turning quickly. "James." Surprise crossed her features, followed by concern. "Can't you sleep?" "Neither can you, apparently." He approached, noting the pages covered with her precise handwriting. "What are you writing?" Margaret looked at the papers, then back at him. Something vulnerable crossed her face, her usual armor momentarily lowered. "A letter to Helena. I know it's absurd writing to the dead, but—" Her voice trailed off. James felt something clench in his chest. Without thinking, he moved closer, placing his hand on her shoulder. "It's not absurd. It's love." She looked at his hand, then raised her eyes to his face. Tears glistened unshed on her lashes. "I'm telling her about our plans, about how we will finally have justice for her, for your mother, for everyone he destroyed." A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "But I also confess that I am afraid. Of what we will do, of the consequences of—" "Of what?" James asked softly, realizing there was more she hesitated to verbalize. Margaret rose abruptly, stepping away from him, hugging herself as if cold despite the warmth of the room. "Of when all this is over, when Cornelius is punished and you regain Rosewood, there will be no more reason for this." She gestured vaguely between them. James understood with sudden, stunning clarity. She feared that their common purpose was the only thing uniting them, that without the conspiracy, their marriage would revert to the empty arrangement they had both initially accepted. "Margaret," he approached her again, this time positioning himself before her, forcing her to look at him. "Do you truly believe that my interest in your company is merely pragmatic?" "I don't know what to believe." Her voice was small, stripped of its usual confidence. "Marriages like ours don't transform into something more. That only happens in silly romances." "Perhaps," James said, reaching for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We are living our own silly romance." She laughed, a broken sound that was half a sob. "You mock me." "Never." He used his free hand to gently wipe the tear from her face, his thumb brushing the scar that he had come to regard not as a blemish, but as a distinctive mark of her strength. "Margaret, in recent weeks, you have become essential. I wake up thinking of our conversations. I spend the day anticipating the moment we will meet again, when you smile genuinely, something in my chest." He did not complete the sentence because Margaret suddenly rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips against his. The kiss was different from the chaste one at the ceremony. This was laden with all the repressed emotion, all the unrecognized longing that had accumulated between them during weeks of forced and chosen proximity. James responded instinctively, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her closer. She was slender, yet firm in his embrace, her fingers lacing through his hair as he deepened the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing rapidly. "This complicates everything," Margaret murmured against his lips. "Yes," James agreed, but he didn't release her. "We cannot allow emotions to cloud our judgment regarding what must be done. No." He kissed her again, more softly this time. "We are fools," she said, but she was smiling now, genuinely, completely transforming her features. "Undoubtedly." James rested his forehead against hers, savoring the simple intimacy of the moment. "But perhaps it is acceptable to be foolish occasionally." They remained like that, embraced in the silent library, as the candle slowly consumed itself. Eventually, they sat together on the sofa by the dormant fireplace, Margaret leaning against James's chest, her head resting beneath his chin. They talked in low voices about everything and nothing. Childhood memories, dreams for the future, fears they rarely admitted even to themselves. "When I was a child," Margaret confessed, "I used to imagine I had been swapped at birth, that my true parents were extraordinary people who would one day come to claim me, and I would finally belong somewhere." She laughed softly at herself. A foolish fantasy of a rejected child. "Not foolish," James said, pressing her closer. "You belong here with me. If this is not home enough, we will make Rosewood our home, together." "Rosewood." Margaret turned to look at him. "You intend to return there?" "Eventually, yes. It is my legacy, my connection to my mother." He hesitated. "But only if you come with me, Hartley House." "Hartley House is a prison of bad memories," she interrupted firmly. "I kept it because I had nowhere to go, no one who truly desired me. But now—" Her eyes met his. "Now I have you." The weight of those simple words reverberated through James. He had her, she had him, and together they would face whatever came. The morning brought Lord Worthington, who arrived precisely at 10 o'clock as his correspondence had indicated. They met him in the main drawing room, where Margaret had ordered coffee and cakes to be served. The elderly man seemed graver than usual, his aristocratic features arranged in serious lines. "My dear," he said, kissing Margaret's cheek before shaking James's hand firmly. "Your message from Bath was disturbing." "Disturbing but necessary," Margaret replied, gesturing for him to sit. She handed him Lady Ashford's deposition, watching as he read with increasing attention. When Worthington finally set down the papers, he seemed to have aged years. "This is evidence of murder. Do you comprehend the implications?" "Completely," James said. "It is precisely on this that we require your counsel." "There are two options," Worthington began, accepting the tea Margaret offered him. "We can take this to the magistrates, initiate criminal proceedings. With Lady Ashford's deposition, the financial documents you have already compiled, and testimony from both of you regarding the circumstances, there is a reasonable chance of conviction. Cornelius would be hanged." Margaret and James exchanged glances, silent communication flowing between them. "And the second option?" Margaret asked. "Confront him privately. Offer him a choice between permanent exile or public exposure. He would keep his life, but lose everything else: reputation, property, social standing." Worthington paused. "Personally, considering the gravity of his crimes, the first option seems more appropriate, but I understand there are personal considerations involved." James rose, moving to the window. Outside, the gardens of Hartley House shimmered under the morning sun, a promise of spring peeking through the waning winter. He thought of his mother, of her essential kindness, of how she believed in redemption even for those who did not deserve it. "He killed my sister," Margaret said softly behind him, "and your mother. How many other victims are there that we do not know of? If we allow him to live, even exiled, what prevents him from destroying more lives?" "Nothing," James admitted, turning to face her. "But if we send him to the gallows, we become executioners. That responsibility will change who we are." "It already has," she replied, but there was doubt in her eyes now. Worthington watched them with an indecipherable expression. "You do not need to decide immediately, but I would advise you not to delay excessively. The longer you wait, the greater the risk of Cornelius discovering your intentions." "1 week," James said decisively. "We will give ourselves 1 week to ponder adequately. Then we will act." Margaret nodded slowly. 1 week. Worthington rose, preparing to depart. "I remain at your disposal, whatever your decision," and he looked at them both with paternal affection. "I hope you find clarity not only on this matter, but on your own lives. Marriage is a long journey. Best to undertake it with a solid foundation." After he left, Margaret and James remained in the drawing room, the weight of the pending decision hanging over them. Finally, Margaret reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Whatever our choice," she said, "we make it together." "Together," James agreed, squeezing her hand. And in that moment, with sunlight flooding the drawing room and the promise of spring in the air, James understood that regardless of what they decided about Cornelius, something fundamental had changed between him and Margaret. They were no longer strangers united by convenience, but genuine partners, trust and affection growing between them like delicate plants seeking light. The following week would be crucial, not only for determining Cornelius's fate, but for defining their own future. And for the first time since he had signed that marriage contract in Cornelius's gloomy library, James felt something akin to true hope. The week Worthington had granted for deliberation passed with torturous slowness and alarming speed simultaneously. James found himself oscillating between absolute certainty that Cornelius deserved maximum punishment and corrosive doubts about the right to inflict such a fate, even on someone so guilty. Margaret, surprisingly, revealed similar ambivalence. During their nightly conversations, which now often extended into the early hours of dawn, she confessed fears she had never shared with another human being. "I dream of Helena," she said one night, leaning against James on the library sofa, where they had established a private sanctuary. "She asked me why I waited so long, why I didn't save her when there was time." James kissed her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender that had become as familiar as it was comforting. "You were young, with no resources of your own. You could have done nothing. Logic does not silence guilt." She turned to look at him, her brown eyes reflecting the dancing candlelight. "And now, when I can finally act, I find myself hesitant. What does that say about me?" "That you possess a conscience, humanity." James touched her face gently. "Imagined vengeance is always simpler than executed justice." The Pemberton dinner, postponed due to the trip to Bath, finally took place on the 5th night. Margaret had insisted they maintain social engagements to avoid suspicion. They presented themselves as a harmonious couple, James offering his arm with a naturalness that was no longer feigned, Margaret accepting with a smile that reached her eyes. Lady Pemberton, a robust, middle-aged woman with a maternal temperament, received them warmly. "Mrs. Hartley, what a joy to see you so radiant. Matrimony clearly suits you." Margaret blushed slightly, her hand tightening on James's arm almost imperceptibly. "Lord Pemberton is too kind." The evening passed pleasantly, conversation flowing among the 12 guests about politics, literature, minor scandals of local society. James found himself genuinely enjoying the company, particularly when Margaret demonstrated her sharp intellect in a debate on agricultural reforms with a conservative gentleman who clearly did not expect a woman to possess well-founded opinions on the subject. "Your wife is remarkable," Sir Pemberton commented when the gentleman retired for brandy after dinner. "I have always admired her intelligence, though many consider it improper in a lady. "Then many are fools," James replied calmly, satisfaction warming his chest at the approving surprise in his host's eyes. During the return to Hartley House, Margaret remained silent, contemplating the darkness beyond the carriage window. When James covered her hand with his, she intertwined her fingers automatically, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft in the darkness. "For what? For defending me? For not being ashamed of my direct nature?" She turned to face him, though she could barely distinguish his features in the gloom. "Edmund constantly criticized my tendency for opinion. He said I drove away respectable company." "Edmund was an idiot." James pulled her closer, allowing her to rest her head on his shoulder. "Your intelligence is part of what makes you extraordinary." He felt her smile against his neck. "You possess a disturbing talent for saying exactly what I need to hear. It's not a talent when it's simple truth." That night, for the first time, Margaret accompanied him to his chambers in the East Wing, not out of urgent passion, but from a mutual desire not to spend any more nights separated by empty corridors and empty conventions. They lay together, fully clothed over the covers, their bodies intertwined as they talked in murmurs until sleep finally claimed them. James woke at dawn to find Margaret already awake, watching him with an expression that mingled tenderness and melancholy. "I have made a decision," she said softly, "about Cornelius." James waited, his heart quickening. "I cannot send him to his death." The words came out with difficulty, laden with the weight of surrender. "I hate him absolutely. I wish to see him suffer for what he did to Helena, to your mother. But executing him, even indirectly through the law, will not restore what we lost. It will only add more death to an already unbearable tally." James felt immense relief flood his chest. "I agree. Exile, complete destruction of his reputation and means, but not death." Margaret nodded, silent tears tracing her face. James wiped them away gently, understanding that they were mourning not only for Helena, but for the vengeance she had learned to release. "Helena would have approved," he said, with a certainty he felt deeply. "From what you told me about her, I don't believe she would wish us to stain our souls with blood, even justified." "I hope you're right." Margaret embraced him, and they remained thus as morning light gradually illuminated the room, two survivors choosing mercy over vengeance, forgiveness over fury. Lord Worthington arrived as requested that afternoon. They heard their decision with silent approval. Then he helped them formulate a meticulous plan. Cornelius would be summoned to Hartley House under the pretext of signing documents related to the marriage settlement. There, they would confront him with the complete evidence. They would offer him 24 hours to leave England permanently, renouncing all properties and rights. Failure to comply would result in the immediate handover of evidence to the authorities. "He will accept," Worthington predicted. "Men like Cornelius are fundamentally cowards. Faced with inevitable destruction, they will choose survival, even a dishonorable one." The letter was sent. Cornelius replied promptly, agreeing to appear after 3 days. James used that time to prepare himself emotionally, Margaret constantly by his side, her presence an anchor that kept him from drifting into fury or doubt. On the designated morning, they arranged the library as an improvised courtroom. Documents were laid out methodically on the mahogany table, 3 chairs positioned, 2 for them, 1 for the accused. Worthington would remain present as a witness and legal counsel. Cornelius arrived punctually, his elaborate carriage contrasting with the increasing austerity James had noticed in his appearance the last time they met. Debts accumulating, James presumed. Good. It would facilitate his ruin. "My dear stepson," Cornelius greeted as he entered the library, forced confidence in his voice. "And Mrs. Hartley, what an unexpected pleasure." His gaze slid to Worthington, confusion crossing his features. "Lord Worthington, I did not expect—" "Sit down, Cornelius," Margaret interrupted coldly, gesturing to the isolated chair. Something in her tone alerted him. Cornelius hesitated, his survival instincts clearly activated. "Perhaps we should— now." James allowed a military command to enter his voice. an authority he had inherited from generations of aristocratic ancestors. Cornelius sat slowly, eyes narrowed, calculating escape routes. Margaret began methodically, presenting each document, each proof of fraud, embezzlement, forgery. James watched as colour gradually drained from Cornelius's face, confidence dissolving into thinly disguised panic. When Margaret finally produced Lady Ashford's deposition, Cornelius rose abruptly. "Lies! That woman is mad. Everyone knows." "Sit down," Worthington ordered, his voice cutting like a blade. "We have additional witnesses. Apothecaries who sold arsenic, servants who observed your actions. You have no defense." Cornelius collapsed into the chair, sweat glistening on his forehead. "What do you want? Money? I can." "You possess nothing we desire," James said, rising and approaching until he stood directly before the man who had destroyed his life. "You murdered my mother. You probably murdered Margaret's sister. You stole. You lied. You ruined countless lives. You deserve to be hanged." "Then why?" Cornelius's voice broke. "Because," Margaret interjected, joining James, "our souls are worth more than vengeance. You will live but as a ghost. 24 hours to leave England. All your assets reverted to their rightful victims. Any attempt to return or communicate will result in full exposure and criminal prosecution." Cornelius looked between them, searching for mercy or negotiation. He found only relentless determination. "I agree," he murmured finally, "but I will need funds for passage to establish myself." "You will receive £50, Worthington said dryly. "A generous sum considering your circumstances. Use it wisely. There will be no second opportunity." Renunciation documents were presented. Cornelius signed with trembling hands, each signature sealing his complete defeat. When they finished, Worthington collected everything methodically, while James and Margaret remained united, watching the man who had caused so much suffering finally reduced to a pathetic, defeated creature. "May I ask," Cornelius said as he rose to leave, a last attempt to regain some dignity, "why you spared me? Why didn't you simply destroy me?" Margaret exchanged a look with James before responding. "Because we chose to be defined not by what you did to us, but by who we decided to be despite you. Now go, and pray we never cross paths again." Cornelius left, stooped and defeated. Through the window they watched his carriage disappear down the winding road, carrying him away from their lives forever. "It's over," Margaret murmured, leaning against James. "Yes," he wrapped his arms around her, feeling tension finally drain from them both. "And now we truly begin." Worthington departed shortly after, promising to finalize property transfers and legal matters. When they were finally alone, Margaret and James remained in the library where it had all begun that first wedding night, which seemed simultaneously yesterday and an eternity ago. "Rosewood," James said softly, "will you come with me when we reclaim it?" "Wherever you go," Margaret replied, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. "You are my home now." Months later, when spring finally bloomed completely, transforming Rosewood Manor's gardens into a tapestry of colours and perfumes, James and Margaret walked among the rose bushes his mother had planted years before. The estate breathed life again, restored through hard work and combined resources. Margaret had cultivated a memorial garden for Helena, white roses that bloomed profusely. There she spoke with her sister, sharing joys and hopes, keeping memory alive not through bitterness but through continued love. "I am pregnant," she announced one afternoon, watching James pull weeds near his mother's rose bushes. He rose so abruptly that he dropped his tools. "You? Are you sure?" "Completely." Her smile was radiant, transforming her into something luminous. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I visited the village." James crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, embracing her carefully, reverent fear mingling with overwhelming joy. "A son. Or daughter," Margaret corrected. "I hope it's a girl. One we can raise to be strong, independent, absolutely loved." "Like your mother," James agreed, kissing her deeply. As they remained embraced among flowers that represented the past and the promise of the future, James understood that sometimes the best gifts arrive wrapped in the most improbable circumstances. Their forced marriage had transformed into a genuine partnership, then into a deep love that would sustain not only them, but future generations. Margaret lifted her face to the sun, peace finally settling on features that had carried pain for so long. "Helena would have loved this," she murmured. "To see us happy, building something beautiful from the ashes." "She knows," James said with conviction. "From somewhere, she knows and approves. And in that garden bathed in spring light, surrounded by the scent of roses and the promise of new life growing, two survivors who chose mercy over vengeance, love over bitterness, finally found the peace they both had deserved all along."